I was assigned the topic under the general heading of religious freedom and sustainable peace. I would like to focus my comments under the heading relocating religious freedom and reimagining sustainable peace in the context of multilateralism and in the service of transformation. What do I mean by multilateralism for the purposes of our discussion? By multilateralism, I refer to that creature of modernity and the modern system of states that arose from what I call the transformation of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and its various mutations and permutations in the past 369 years. We know that multilateralism today as the principle that makes possible our acting together with commonly established rules, mechanisms, and institutions such as those evolved, enacted, or inspired under the auspices of the United Nations. By multilateralism, I mean the intent and resolve to address issues that are better done collaboratively rather than singly and in isolation. These are the issues that cut across the boundaries that the nation states, sovereign entities as they are, have erected. These are the issues that are as global and as they are local, like addressing the scourge of violence and terrorism, and the protection of human rights made possible through a multilateral negotiation that produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and subsequent conventions and protocols that today form a solid human rights regime. And what about transformation? Perhaps by our acting together and collaboratively, we will have contributed to the transformation of this world. Indeed, to make this world a better place, to echo Dr. Diop from his earlier report yesterday. The history of the West, if not world history itself, is testimony to a number of political, economic, and cultural experiments to establish what I call multi-sided, pluralist, and hopefully transformative relationships at various levels of local, national, regional, international, transnational, and global life. Early in the 20th century, the West had its League of Nations, and in the post-World War II, the United Nations itself, and perhaps the most successful multilateral experiment of our time. Indeed, contemporary discourses on transformation at the international level cannot be extricated from these multilateral experiments. I suggest that we can trace the evolution of the idea and practice of religious liberty, not solely, but part of that discourse, including the juridical protections we have given to religious freedom through these multilateral experiments. At the same time, these state-oriented experiments did not and could not have exhausted the idea of multilateralism and transformation, broadly defined. From the Communist International of the 19th century to the non-aligned movement of the 1960s, indeed even Davos and the IMF World Bank of the 1990s, and the myriad political and social formations in global civil society, take, for example, the World Social Forums. To be sure, multilateralism and transformation are contested notions, not only because of the complexity of their practices or their political and ideological uses and misuses, but also because of the enormous appetite that they have for human and non-human capital. The argument for multilateralism, if you will, as both a strategy and as a way of life, and of transformation of the realities it signifies, is a very straightforward one. It goes simply, but exquisitely, if you will, to the fundamental question about the nature and character of life at least in the 21st century. Science, religion, and faith today lead us down the pathway of pluralism, complexity, and contingency. Each proclaims that life is always and already more than what one can define through reason. In theoretical claims, as in normative assertions, say in politics, in economics, and in culture, indeed at the level of ecology, plenitude must be the defining character of normative, if not experienced reality. Intolerance of every kind, including religious intolerance, stymies, subverts, and denies that plenitude. Therefore, transformation itself is defined as plenitude. The refusal to articulate one's present and future within this context and framework leads to a fundamental denial of human life. To deny life is to invite and enter into premature death. To assert that multilateralism and transformation are forms of practice is to suggest that by definition, multilateralism and transformation are more than relationships among sovereign states. No doubt, this has been the meaning ascribed to multilateralism in international relations. Still, to understand multilateralism and transformation as creatures of human life and not simply of the system of states is to immediately place them in the realm of politics and ethics. That is, not only what we ought to do, but also the pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful. My assertion here is that we understand politics to be all that we can and need to do together. The relation of religious freedom and sustainable peace is therefore not only palpable, but in many realms co-constitutive. Intolerance, violations of the freedom of conscience and religion, belief or unbelief, can be manifest in the realms of religion and state. Hence, the traditional concern about religion and state or church and state relations. What multilateralism brings, if you will, to religious polity, I suggest, is the challenge to go beyond the binary of religion and state or church and state. What to me turns these binary relations into transformative relations is the recognition that these relations, in the end, are about what the role of people, about the role that peoples play in these institutions. Put in another way, the relation truly is not binary, but a triadic one. Church, state, and people, or religion, state, and people. The contestations in the relation are about the support and allegiance of people. I submit that violations of religious freedom, and for the same reason, violations of human rights happen when people are disregarded in the relation. The paradox we find in the balancing we often do in church-state relations discourses is a question of location and positionality. The balancing happens on one end at the center of multilateral negotiations, and on another end from a reading of sacred religious texts and precepts and how they are lived out in both institutions and personal lives. Either way, negotiating religious freedom within the construct of nation-state and within religions is at the very least messy. In the wide scope of human rights, discourse, and practice, we must look at the robust, albeit contested terrains of discourse and practice in, for example, ecological and environmental politics, as well as in matters of sexuality, gender, race, and class. All this, I must say, strike acutely and into deeply held convictions and beliefs that when raised to the level of religion, indeed ideology, raises the contestation even more intensely, so that contestation prefigures, if not leads to, incivility in the public discourse, if not violence in the public square. Today, it is no longer possible to simply assume that multilateralism is mainly either about the identities of particular individuals or specific states, but rather about the demands for recognition by those who have been historically misrecognized, indeed excluded, and that any notion of political identity or formation must include these demands as part of its self-understanding. When these are put in the social, political, and religious equation, peace as equanimity and harmony may manifest as, in fact, disturbed and challenged, precisely because when deeply held beliefs or historic apathy and ignorance come into play, peace is also challenged. And challenged it will be, if only for the proposition that prospers discourse and praxis that leads to sustainable and just peace. I submit that it is no longer possible to make facile assertions, as modern epistemologists and ontologists do, about the separation, say, of knowledge and power, of reason and desire, of fact and value, of language and institutions, that in fact what appears to be abstract in reality are articulations of actual relations of ruling, beyond the fact that they may also be mere ideological legitimations of certain ruling elites. This warning is particularly relevant to the aspirations of theories of transformation, including what constitutes religious freedom, if such freedom seeks to contribute to the flourishing of conscience and thought, if not life and living. We must attend to the very language that is the discursive formations and strategies of multilateralism and transformation itself, as part of the task of rethinking the identity of states, nations, and peoples, not to mention aspirations towards theories of transformation, especially the theory and practice of religious freedom. This is crucial, especially as we hold the view that religious freedom, as a protected human right, is not singularly any more important than any other in the pantheon of human rights. I'm skipping several pages in the interest of time. Kofi Annan, the United Nations former Secretary General, made the case for larger freedom. It was a signature proposition he made toward the end of his remarkable term at the helm of the United Nations. Annan urged member states to not treat the reform proposals he was making in an a la carte fashion, but rather as a package. He was referring, of course, to what he called in larger freedom. In that reform package, Annan propounded the idea, quote, that development, security, and human rights go hand in hand, unquote. He asserted that in a world of interconnected threats and opportunities, it is in each country's self-interest that all of these challenges are addressed effectively. The cause of larger freedom can only be advanced if nations work together, and the United Nations can only help if it is remolded as an effective instrument of their common purpose. This larger conception of what might make for a better, more secure, and more sustainable world is an unprecedented reimagining of the international system and the affairs and relations of nations, including private entities like NGOs and civil society writ large. I spoke repetitively of imagination because the United Nations comes out of the genius of that imagination. It is an imagination that is mediated by memory of the past as well as hopes for the future. Lest we forget, the United Nations was forged in the crucible of world wars, of genocide, of the Holocaust, and of colonialism. It was to put in check fascism, unilateralism, and hegemony. Visionaries of international affairs forged a multilateral platform that now proves essential in the relations of nations and peoples. I humbly submit to you, in closing, that the imagination required of us today in the public square is one that brings together the concerns of what makes for a better world. And by that I mean the entire Earth and cosmos, and the entire human family in such a way that our common patrimony, the global commons, if you will, can truly be common, commonly clean, commonly sustainable, commonly livable for all, without pockets and ghettos of fear and want, racism and racial discrimination, intolerance and xenophobia. The wanton disregard for the protections now in place to check these conditions must be checked, lest intolerance, indeed impunity, may abound. I submit to you further that religions are in a place and time to seek and affirm peace, sustainability, development, and human rights as normative values embodying a compassionately ordered and justly governed world community. The engagement of religions and diverse faith and cultural traditions by the UN, governments, and civil society places them in a common setting for examining shared burdens, vulnerabilities, and aspirations. The quest for sustainable peace and justice and the need to overcome violence binds religions, governments, and the UN together. Dr. Diop and Irla, your theme at this 8th World Congress speaks forcefully to the enterprise for which we are gathered today. That is, that religious freedom not only presages but points to that hope for peaceful coexistence. And my take today in this presentation was that the coexistence of values we hold dear and the practical things that make for peace are what matters and are those that mitigate, if not eliminate, every form of intolerance. In what way might values and practical steps be combined? Perhaps in this formulation: food and freedom, jobs and justice, land and liberation. If only this, and this alone, that freedom and peace might truly exist and reign. Thank you very much.